What's up, guys? Welcome back to Haunted and Shit, a podcast where we talk about haunted shit and all things spooky, scary, creepy. I'm your host, and on today's episode, we're going to be diving into the very disturbing story of Dorothea Puente. Before I get started, I do want to say a huge thank you to everyone who's listening and everyone that's been supporting this podcast on all its different platforms. Just a heads up that we are now up on Spotify, so you can listen to us on there, and this podcast also lives on Apple Podcasts, obviously, YouTube, and Podbean. So, Dorothea Puente, man, this lady, she's crazy, like, literally crazy. So, some of you may have heard of Dorothea from that Netflix show that came out where there was one episode about her and everyone was freaking out over this old lady that was murdering people. I distinctly remember it. This was the first time that I also heard about Dorothea, and then from there I kind of did my own research on the internet and dug up all this other information, but let me tell you guys, this story is crazy. Oh, and before I get started, as always, any links for any of the websites or other information that I talk about today will be down in the description. But without further ado, let's get right into the spooky shit. Dorothea Puente was born Dorothea Helen Gray in January of 1929 in Redlands, California. Her life was really bad from the get-go. Her parents were both alcoholics, and her father commonly verbally abused her by threatening to kill himself in front of her, which I can imagine was traumatizing as a child. She, at this point, would have been like younger than 10 years old, so that's crazy. After her father passed of tuberculosis and her mom was also out of the picture, she was eventually sent with her siblings to live in an orphanage, and her life did not get much better after this. She unfortunately suffered from being sexually assaulted while she was at the orphanage, so all throughout her childhood she was treated very, very horribly, and she had a really tough upbringing. So, you know, this kind of like opened my eyes to the fact that obviously she was not given a very good life growing up, and so maybe that's the reason for like the horrible things that she's done. But honestly, guys, I don't think that anything can really like make an excuse for murdering 9 people, so I don't know, but let's keep going. So Dorothea's first marriage was when she was 16 years old, and she had a couple of children with her first husband, but they were all either like sent away to live with other family members or put up for adoption, or she had a miscarriage. So all of the children that she gave birth to were not raised by her, which is probably a good thing. Dorothea's first arrest was in 1948 when she attempted to buy women's clothing with a forged check. So guys, this isn't that weird, right? Like, she used a forged check. That's very common. This is a thing that happens all the time. Like, it's not murder. So it seems like she maybe started off with these very like minimal, forged check is still really, really bad, but compared to the things that she eventually does, I would love to know like her thought process in this. Like, if she had a plan her whole life knowing that she was going to end up killing people to get their money, or if she was just fell into these situations that made her look like a bad person. But I don't think that's the case. I think that she had like a very good understanding of what she was doing, and she was just a malicious person, because by the sounds of everything that I learned about her, like, it shows that she didn't really have remorse for the things that she did, and she obviously didn't care about people the way that she portrayed that she did. So Dorothea ended up pleading guilty to the charge with the forged check, and she ended up serving 4 months in jail, and when she got out, she left that area that she lived in. So she ends up moving to San Francisco, where she ends up meeting her second husband. So in 1952, she gets married to a man with the last name Johansson, and for some really weird reason that I can't figure out, she decided to start going by a fake persona. So instead of calling herself Dorothea Johansson or Dorothea Gray or whatever her name actually was, she would go by the name Taya Singawala Nayarda, and I may have completely butchered that, I apologize. But she pretended to be of Egyptian and Israeli descent. And she would also take a lot of advantage of her husband being away for work, because he worked on boats. And when he was away at sea, she invited men over to their house and gambled away his money, like held gambling nights and gambled away his money. Like, who in the world does that to their own husband? So obviously she was using this guy for his money, or maybe she did love him, but she loved his money more. I don't know. And these things that she's doing so far are pretty weird, but it gets a lot weirder than that. In 1960, Dorothea is actually arrested for owning and operating a brothel. A literal brothel, guys. At this point, she would have been about 30 years old, and her life goal is to own a brothel now. So she's operating this brothel, she gets arrested for it, and she ends up serving 90 days in prison. And after she gets let out, not long after, about a year or less than a year later, she gets admitted to a mental hospital by her husband, because apparently she went on like a whole bender where she was drinking and lying, and she had multiple suicide attempts during this time as well. So her husband is obviously concerned for her safety, his safety, her health, everything. So he ends up admitting her into a mental hospital. And not very long after that, in 1966, her husband and her split up. And at this point, she continues to use his last name. She actually changes her name or goes by the name Sharon Johansson. And her whole idea at this point is to create a persona and a reputation of being a very respectable Christian woman. Like, you know, she's getting a little bit older. She would have been 36, almost 40. So she's now kind of beginning to use like her being a woman, her age, and her religion as cover-ups for all of the horrible things that she's been doing. In a way that she, you know, the public would look at her and be like, oh no, this lady like would never kill someone or even use a forged check. Like, they did not suspect anything of her. This is also when she begins to work as a caregiver, where she would start taking people into her home that were mostly women too, that needed to be taken out of like abusive relationships, or if people were suffering from really bad drug addictions, and like the worst of the worst too. Like, she would take cases that nobody else would want to take, and this just showed everyone else in the community that this lady is amazing. She's an angel. She's God. She's come down and she's like taking everybody in and taking care of them. That is so awesome. And everyone believes her. Everyone's like, wow, this lady's great. And it continues on for a very long time. So in 1968, this is when Dorothea ends up having her third marriage, which only lasts for 16 months. And when Dorothea goes to serve her ex-husband, or husband at the time, divorce papers, he has already fled to Mexico. So he's gone. I don't know if he had that plan or not, but he was out. There must have been a reason. He must have been like, this lady's literally crazy. But she also uses his surname for a while, which is how we know her, Dorothea Puente, and she goes by that pretty much up until the day that she passes. So in 1982, this is when she officially opens her boarding house in Sacramento, and I like to call this place the real-life AHS murder house, because today it is actually a stop on a lot of paranormal / ghost tours of Sacramento. So it's kind of like, if you've ever seen American Horror Story, the first season is based on a house that they call Murder House, where a lot of horrible murders have happened, and it's, you know, featured on these big Hollywood tours and whatever. So I like to call it that because I think it's pretty fitting. Little did the community know that she was actually murdering the people that were coming into her home that she was taking in. She was poisoning them or drugging them to the point where they knocked out and died, and then she would proceed to bury them and move their bodies into her backyard. Or, nope, that's backwards. She would move their bodies into her backyard and then bury them. And she did all of this just for their Social Security checks. And the way that she was doing this was she was taking whatever income was coming into... And the way that she was doing this was she was taking any Social Security checks that were coming to her door for these people and giving them a portion of it and then pocketing the rest for quote-unquote expenses. I assume that she told them, you know, oh, the boarding home needs this, this, and this, and, you know, you're living here, so I need to take this money. In reality, she was taking that money and using it for herself. And this is a really common theme throughout her life. Like, she just kind of wants a lot of money all the time. So the first big interaction that we see between Dorothea and the police coming to this boarding house that she's been running is in 1982, when there's a woman named Ruth Monroe that began living with Puente, and eventually she ends up dying of an overdose, and the police come, and Dorothea says, she had been dealing with a lot of depression, and she just had been having a really hard time, and she told the police that she was on drugs when she came to Dorothea's house, and because of the way that Dorothea played it off, because of the situation, because of the the fact that the people that were coming into Dorothea's house very well could be people that have severe drug addictions and could be overdosing. So there really wasn't anything odd going on in the police's vision, in the police's opinion at that point. And so the police did just see it as an overdose, and they really didn't suspect anything else was going on, and nothing else was done about it at that time. But now this is when the police are kind of being called to her property more commonly, and things start to kind of, get rolling, and the police are having a lot more interactions with Dorothea and the people that are living in her house. So a few weeks after this whole Ruth Monroe thing happens, there's a man that complains to the police that Dorothea attempted to drug and steal from him. And this leads to Puente actually being convicted for these theft charges, and she was sentenced to 5 years in prison. During her time in prison, she started communicating with someone named Everson Gilmouth, who she became kind of like pen pals with, and they developed a friendship. And once she was released from prison, he was actually the person to pick her up from prison in his pickup truck. And eventually their friendship turned into a relationship, and eventually they were in a full-blown long-term relationship, thinking about getting married. Now Dorothea does something that I would have never ever expected, but it happened. So, like I said, she creates this relationship with Everson, and a while after she was let out of prison, she has this man come over to install some, something in her apartment. He was like a wood person, someone putting wood in her apartment, and after he's done, she gives him $800 for the labor, and the red pickup truck that it's Everson's pickup truck, right? So she gives this random wood installation man $800 for whatever work he did, and then also gives him the Ford pickup truck. She says to this man that, oh, it's my boyfriend's truck and he doesn't need it anymore and he left it here, so you can take it. And so, obviously, I can imagine this man is like, hell yeah, free pickup truck, that's great. And so, now she asked this man, she said, hey, I need you to run to a store for me to grab a box. I need you to run to the store for me to get a box. I have some stuff that I want to put in it, books and maybe donation things or whatever. So he's like, okay, yeah, I'll help out this lady. Goes to the store, gets her a box. He comes back, and she puts whatever in the box, and now she asks him, hey, can you drive me to a storage depot to put this box in the storage depot? And he's like, yeah, sure, there's nothing weird about this. It's just an old lady asking for stuff to be moved to a storage unit, which any person probably would agree to do that. So while they're on the way to the storage unit, she asks him to stop at a unofficial dumping site where people kind of leave household junk that they just don't want. It's next to a river. And she asks him to stop and I'm just going to dispose of this at the junkyard. So they do that. And there was a fisherman that was near them when this was happening. And he said hey, he called the police and he's like, hey, there's a really weird box that someone dropped off here that just kind of looks a little sus. And I would like you guys to come out and look at it. Because somebody dropped it off at the dumping site and it kind of looks suspicious. So the police do end up coming. They find the box and they open it. And what is in it? Not books, not donation items, not, anything that you would expect an old lady to have in a box, but Everson Gilmouth, guys. Everson Gilmouth's body is in this box. So obviously she killed him. We know that. And she now has disposed of his body at this dumping site. What a wonderful woman. So nobody finds out that this person's remains are Everson Gilmouth's until 3 years later. So at this point, they have found this guy's body, but they have not connected it to Dorothea. So Dorothea is continuing on with her life. Like she's continuing with her boarding home and her whole like facade of being a cute old lady that's cute and whatever. And she is full-blown running this boarding house, and she's taking in more people. And so what eventually leads to her being caught is actually a person that was being spotted around Dorothea's house very commonly. He would be seen taking items in and out of the house and like moving things around the house in a wheelbarrow and doing a lot of like strange things, kind of, it could have been just yard work, but the way that he was doing it, how often he was doing it, it was just kind of suspicious. So neighbors are getting kind of weirded out by this whole thing. Apparently I don't know who like discovered this. I don't know if this was discovered after the murders or before, but the person that was going around the house and doing all the stuff also redid the concrete in the basement of the house, which is like a very weird thing to do, I feel like, like once a house is built, once the foundation of the basement is down, like you're not gonna put another slab of concrete there. So very strange that happens. But then also the man that's doing all this work disappears. So now this is like really weird, right? There's like more weird things going on that just kind of are adding up, and maybe at this point people are starting to think this lady's got some suspicious stuff going on. So now at this point we're in 1988, and this is when the actual arrest of Dorothea Puente occurs and when everything is discovered about, everything that she's been doing. So the reason that this happens is because there is a tenant that lives in Dorothea's house named Alvaro, and he was a mentally disabled man. He had schizophrenia, and he was placed there specifically by a social worker who met Dorothea and said like, hey, I have this person that really needs a home, and he doesn't have anywhere else to go, doesn't have any family, like he really needs somewhere. And obviously Dorothea gave her little show of being such a caring woman and was like, oh my god, yes. So she takes Alvaro into her house, and after a while weird things started to happen involving Alvaro. Like he would be gone every single time that the social worker would visit Dorothea's property. And she would come up with an excuse like, oh, he's out, he's doing something, which was strange because this man had schizophrenia. So like, granted, he could, probably go out and do anything by himself, but if he was gone for a while, that's kind of strange. And this would happen a lot whenever this social worker lady would come to visit Dorothea's boarding house. And so at a certain point, Dorothea says that Alvaro has gone to see his family. And this like rings a million alarm bells in the social worker's brain because Alvaro didn't have any family, at least none that the social worker knew of. And so now it's like, whoa. Like, you've been saying he's out, he's never there, I haven't seen him, and now you're saying that he's gone to do something that I know very well is not possible. So now we need to start figuring out, like, what she's hiding. So eventually the social worker does end up calling the police to Dorothea's property, and they search it. They notice that there's some, like, ground in the backyard that's been dug up, and recently, like, you can see that the soil has been moved, and the police end up digging in the backyard and they find 9 bodies. Those 9 bodies were Everson Gilmouth, who was Puente's boyfriend, as well as 8 other people who had been living in the boarding house. So that was Ruth Monroe that I had mentioned, another woman named Leona Carpenter, Alvaro, who was also found in the backyard, Dorothy Miller, Benjamin Fink, James Gallup, Vera Faye Martin, and Betty Palmer. And now I also want to mention that all of these people were over the age of 50. So she took advantage of older people that had either mental disabilities, physical disabilities, just really, really horrible things going on in their lives, took advantage of them and took their lives for their money. So you would think that Puente would be immediately arrested, right? Like, you have 9 bodies buried in your backyard. You're going to jail for the rest of your life. But in the initial investigation, she was actually not considered a suspect. And she was actually allowed to leave the boarding house, and go do something else while the police were doing their investigation. And obviously, she took this opportunity to flee. So she fled to Los Angeles, and she goes into a bar, and she talks to this man that's in there, and she's, whatever, she's a lady talking. And he notices that she looks really familiar. And he's like, oh my God, this is the lady that is on the TV that's like, I guess, he doesn't see her as a suspect, but he kind of puts 2 and 2 together and is like, oh my God, this lady's involved with some kind of murder. And so he ends up actually contacting the police, and they come and they find her and arrest her. So at this point, the police are able to say, okay, obviously this lady wouldn't be running away in the way that she is and being like so suspicious about all of this if she wasn't involved at least a little bit. So they arrest her. And through the investigation, they discovered that the way that she was killing these people was giving them sleeping pills where they would pass out. She would then proceed to suffocate them and then wrap them up in plastic and drag them into her backyard, where she would hire people to dig for her and then put the bodies in there. So after the investigation, obviously the trial happens, and Puente is only convicted of 3 murders. And the rest, the other 6, the jury could not decide on. They were deadlocked 7-5 on whether she was going to be convicted of the other 6 murders. So she was sent to jail. She was kept at the Central California Women's Facility. And for the rest of her life, she basically said that she was not guilty and held that until the moment that she died. And she eventually passed because of natural causes in 2011. She was 82 years old, and she never pled guilty. And even though she did die, she will never be forgotten. Everybody will remember the story about the crazy old lady that killed 9 people. And, after this, the media was all over it. The house itself has been featured on multiple different TV shows. The story of all of this has been, made into documentaries, movies, TV shows, just about everything that you can imagine. And I know that it's not a very popular story. I know that people weren't really talking about it until Netflix came out with that show, but I do think that this is going to be something that people never forget. But that is all I have for you guys on today's episode. Thank you so much for listening. As always, support the podcast wherever and whenever you can. I do want to mention that the next couple of weeks for episodes are going to be a little weird because I'm coming to the end of my semester in school, and this is when finals are coming up and everything. So there is going to be at least 1 or 2 weeks where I don't come out with an episode. I will be posting that on my Instagram, so make sure you check that to see when my episodes are actually going to be put up. But I will have an episode next week. It might be a little bit shorter, but I am going to try to get one out. But yeah, thank you guys so much for listening, and I will see you next time. But until then, stay spooky.